Forum. I'm Warren Sprouse. You're here with me every night from 8 to 10 p.m. Eastern. 2019 has burst upon the scene. What are we doing as 2019 begins? We've got a benchmark that we can start to measure our progress or the lack thereof. Well, to begin with, there's a study that found that the average American spends about 86 hours a month on the cell phone. How's that? Got the wrong glasses. Another one says a different study discovered that 37% of all Americans have eaten fast food within the last 24 hours. Not me. 60% of all Americans actually believe that they've seen a ghost. The middle class continues to decline, and at this point, half of all American workers make less than $30,533 a year. Since 2007, the total amount of student loan debt in America has nearly tripled. The suicide rate in the United States has risen by 33% just since 1999. Suicide is now the second leading cause of death for Americans aged 15 to 24. They've been raised without hope. According to the United Nations Population Fund, 40% of all births in the United States now happen outside of marriage. If you go back to 1970, that figure was sitting at just 10%. 13 million households in the United States do not always have enough food to eat. According to the U.S. Department of Agriculture, almost 1 out of every 4 children in rural areas is currently living in poverty. At this point, almost 52% of all children live in a home that receives monthly help from the federal government. Over 500,000 people are homeless in the United States right now. Today, 1 million Americans are living in their RVs, and that number is rising with each passing year. Social decay is clearly evident, even in our most prosperous cities. One recent investigation found 300 piles of human feces on the streets of downtown San Francisco. 62% of all U.S. jobs do not pay enough to support a middle-class lifestyle. I believe a middle-class lifestyle is over, I want to say $50,000 a year. I think it's in the 40s, high 40s. In 1980, the average American worker's debt was 1.96 times larger than his or her monthly salary. Today, that number is 5 times higher. Bible says neither a borrower nor a lender be. If you can't pay for it, you don't need it. Over half the country now receives more in government transfer payments than they pay in taxes. According to one recent study, the rate of people 65 and older filing for bankruptcy is 3 times what it was in 1991. Can you say poor planning? More than 100 churches in the United States are dying every single week. That statistic has remained constant since 1980. If you go back to 1986, just 10% of all young adults were religiously unaffiliated. That number is now jumped all the way up to 39%. Unaffiliated. Never been to church, don't care about church, don't know what it's about, don't want to learn. According to one recent survey, Americans from the age of 18 to 29 favored Democrats over Republicans by a 66% to 32% margin. You can thank your public school system and the media for that. One study found that 1/3 of all American teenagers have not read a single book in the last year. And they're all Democrats. The number of married couples with children in the U.S. just reached a 56-year low. Keyword here, marriage. In the city of Baltimore, approximately 1 out of every 4 babies is born as an opioid addict. 25% of the children. According to the New York Times, approximately 110 million Americans have a sexually transmitted disease right now. That means 1/3 of the population. Do you remember 1980? 1980, 83, 87, somewhere in the 80s, this guy from Canada flew in to New York City from Africa with AIDS. Didn't have a name for it in those days. They tracked him down. They knew who he was. He lived in Canada. Instead of isolating him like they did with Typhoid Mary, they began providing the police and the medical people and anybody that handles people not their own family with rubber gloves and with masks. They began an education program to protect society from that person. And that disease began to spread within the homosexual community. And eventually it spread into the heterosexual community. And now we have children born with this sort of thing. 1/3 of the population. All we had to do was to isolate this man so he could not infect other people. And anybody else who came up with it would be isolated from the general population, and we would have stopped it. Why didn't we stop it? The man was homosexual. And they'll tell you it's because they didn't want to be discriminating. I think it was deliberate. How's that? The liberal crowd in our world thinks the population is over, or the world is overpopulated. They're happy that people are dying. Can't stop them from being born. Maybe they'll die quicker. Because the planet can't sustain this. They'll never say it out loud, but they say it every other way. It is being projected that the total amount of plastic in the oceans of the world will exceed the total weight of fish by the year 2050. And plastic isn't all that heavy. 90% of all seabirds in the world now have plastic in their stomachs. Back in 1960, that number was sitting at just 5%. In August, we learned that the number of global earthquakes over the last 30 years had risen to a level that was 50% above normal. In September, an all-time record high 7 named storms were swirling across the globe at the same time. In October, we witnessed the 3rd largest single-day point crash in stock market history on the exact same day that the 3rd most powerful hurricane in U.S. history made landfall. Double whammy. In November, the Camp Fire destroyed 14,000 homes and businesses in Northern California. It was the most destructive wildfire in the history of the state. According to the official Twitter account of Mount Washington Observatory in New Hampshire, they had wind chills of between -70 and -75 degrees on Thanksgiving morning last year. In the aftermath of the magnitude 7 earthquake that rattled Anchorage, the state of Alaska was shaken by more than 1,400 earthquakes. In early December, the largest earthquake in 45 years hit eastern Tennessee. During the last full week before Christmas, the Dow average fell 1,655 points. That was the worst week for the stock market since the financial crisis of 2008. 2008 was the first year of Obama's presidency. The National Retail Federation was projecting that total Christmas spending would surpass $465 billion in 2018. Only 25 countries on the entire planet have a GDP that is greater than that number. And Christmas spending is not essential spending. In 2017, the Dow was either up or down 1% or more just 8 times. In 2018, it happened 64 times. Volatility has returned to Wall Street in a major way, and that's not a good sign. A recent survey of corporate financial officers discovered that 82% of them believe that a recession will have started by the end of 2020. During 2018, a $3.3 trillion budget that the United States is carrying as national debt increased by nearly $1.4 trillion. In 2018, we increased our debt by 1/3. You try that. Year in and year out, we are spending more than we take in. We are now almost $22 trillion in debt, and there is no end to our debt problems on the horizon. Welcome 2019. Maybe it'll get better. Only if we take human beings out of the equation. And there are people trying to do that. Let the machine run the world. It can do better. Trust me, it's coming.